Aquaman was the first movie released by DC after Justice League, bringing with it a big shift in perspective on the universe. After Justice League, the universe became much more loosely connected. What was initially a fairly singular story became a universe made up of many different corners and disconnected characters. Aquaman is one of 4 characters from Justice League or before to get their own movie, or even play a significant role at all. Aquaman and the Lost Kingdom is meaningful in a completely different way, as it was the last film to come out and be part of the DCEU. In some ways, these films form one story, as they follow the same core characters and have a number of themes in common. However, they're both separate stories with separate complete plots and arcs. It's a nice combination of standalone and interconnected. Both of these movies are very firmly within the adventure genre, with the main character being thrown out of their comfort zone and into a world of the unknown to prevent catastrophe. Being so clearly defined can go either of 2 ways. It can become formulaic and boring, or it can be a solid basis for communicating its ideas. The relationship between these films and the adventure genre is the core of this video. But before we get to that, I want to talk about something most everyone loved about these movies, and that is the villains. Firstly, let's take Black Manta. Now I, like many, really like him. He represents Arthur's flaws from the status quo at the beginning of the story. I really like the way he's used in the story after the opening origins. Orm is attacking Arthur with the mistakes of his past. Ocean Master magnifies the problem and pulls it to the forefront of the opposition. I really like the symbolic identity Manta gets, while still being an autonomous threat with a strong backstory and clear motivation. Also, he's just cool as fuck. I love that the whole hater mentality is dialed up to 11, especially in the sequel. Starting the movie by saying climate change is good as long as it leads him closer to killing Aquaman, to straight up melting the polar caps as his main plan for the movie.
His home will burn and his kingdom will fall before my legions.
Trying to murder his infant child and then killing himself rather than letting Aquaman save him. It's beautiful. This is the type of energy we need. Also, the suit looks beautiful. I love that he made it himself, and I love that it's so comic accurate in both films. The same is true for Ocean Master, by the way, who looks really good. Let's talk about Ocean Master. I know this is a very popular version of the character, but I'm not totally convinced. While the performance is on point and the surrounding ideas are good, he is just a fascist in the first movie. Outside of his fascist ideology and rhetoric, there's not all too much to him here. His relationship with Arthur is pretty thin, and the same is true with his mother. It somewhat reminds me of General Zod in Man of Steel. Again, this was a strong performance, but outside of a genetic connection to the main hero, was mainly just a fascist. Interestingly, Aquaman does more to build the world around it than any other DCEU movie. Even Zack Snyder's Justice League, which is around twice as long, and The Flash, a significant portion of which takes place in its own self-contained universe, don't do as much to show us the world around them. This isn't necessarily surprising, as Aquaman is an adventure film. The core of the adventure genre is the relationship of 2 or more things with stark differences. This can be ideological, but is usually a matter of environment and culture. Take, for example, Raiders of the Lost Ark. Indiana Jones spends the majority of the film in countries other than the US. Peru, Nepal, and Egypt are the biggest examples. At the same time, he goes up against Nazis, which adds ideological disagreement into the equation. These fundamentals tend to bring some racist undertones with them. In the Wonder Woman video, we talked about Orientalism, the relationship between the West and the East as depicted in media by the West. In Raiders of the Lost Ark, the main conflict is between a bunch of white people that go to Egypt and fight over the stuff they're stealing from that country while barely giving any agency to the people of Egypt. With this type of relationship baked into the genre, we can ask ourselves how Aquaman manages to maintain an adventure genre while avoiding the problematic basis of it. This is where its secondary genre comes in. The film is also fantasy science fiction. By framing the other as something to do with Atlantis and the divide between the land and the sea rather than the East and the West, Aquaman takes the other away from the global South, thereby curbing the racist stereotypes associated with it. Where these movies really shine, at least in application of genre, is in its use of 2 others. Most adventure films have one. Going back to Raiders of the Lost Ark, this uses only Indiana Jones's other. From his perspective, Nepal, Peru, and Egypt are all embodiments of what is new for him. Both Aquaman films have 2 protagonists. The first had Arthur and Mera, the second had Arthur and Orm. Both films are split between the surface world and Atlantis. In both films, the 2 protagonists try to show the other what is great about their respective homeworld. Let's do this on a case-by-case basis. In Aquaman, Arthur starts the movie completely uninterested in Atlantis, hating it for what it did to his mother. Similarly, Mera thinks of the surface as barbaric and foul due to the pollution of the seas. Throughout the movie, Mera shows Arthur the beauty of the 7 seas, whether it be the city of Atlantis itself or the relationship it has with marine life. Meanwhile, Arthur shows Mera the best of the surface world, acquainting her with a market in Sicily. In Aquaman and the Lost Kingdom, Orm is more or less the same way as Mera at the start of the first Aquaman. He hates the surface world until he's shown its wonders by Arthur. This time, however, Arthur is already familiar with a lot of Atlantis' goings-on. Therefore, Orm doesn't just show him around the seas, but gives him a unique insight that changes his perspective on it. In both films, the adventure genre becomes a part of the relationships between the characters. The changes in locations become analogous to the characters' arcs and their relationships with each other. My favorite example of this is in Aquaman and the Lost Kingdom, where Arthur and Orm go to Black Manta's hidden orichalcum factory. The island that houses the factory is changed by the process of refining it. Everything is bigger and more dangerous. This serves on one hand as a way of introducing Orm to the surface world by throwing him in the deep end. On the other hand though, it also throws Arthur off. It's a way of changing the dynamic between the characters by changing the direction of authority. The King of the Seas, who is supposed to be in his element on the surface, is suddenly just as helpless as the prisoner that's completely new to the surface. It's a great way of connecting the characters through their differences. The same thing can be said for the sequence right before the island, when Arthur and Orm visit the sunken citadel. Here, Arthur, who is supposed to be the authority figure in the seas, is caught off guard by something happening right under his nose since the very start of his tenure as King of Atlantis. Speaking of that bar scene, Aquaman and the Lost Kingdom has a number of nods to the classics of the sci-fi, fantasy, and adventure genres sprinkled throughout. That bar scene has clear Star Wars influences, for example. The story about the Dark Trident and its owner are clearly inspired by Lord of the Rings, down to the Dark Trident influencing the wielder's mood. These nods to the genre's biggest stories are a nice way of respecting what has come before it while still giving it its own spin. For all there is to love about these movies, I struggle with one specific aspect. These two movies don't feel connected to me. Maybe this is a product of the 5-year gap between their releases or studio interference, but it doesn't feel like much of the same story to me. Both films use the adventure genre in the same way, as explained earlier, and there are a few recurring characters, but overall, these two films are fairly separate. I noticed this the most in two parts of the movie. Firstly, the setting. Both these films cycle through locations fairly quickly. However, there are only two major locations that play a role in both films, namely the Curry family house and the city of Atlantis. This isn't necessarily all that much of a problem, but I find it noteworthy due to the nature of these films. Both movies use Black Manta and Orm as central characters, their arcs extended over both films. Going back to notable locations from the first film in the second one, maybe by engaging with the trench again, as most everyone seemed to like that part of the first movie, would help to create a sense of cohesion across projects. Secondly, we're going back to the characters. While most of the original core cast returned, the importance of most of these characters is dialed down significantly to give more space for Orm. Especially Mira's role is reduced greatly in the interest of providing space for Arthur and Orm to bond, and that's where we run into the problem. Orm in Aquaman and the Lost Kingdom is nothing like he was in the first movie. In Aquaman, he's essentially a Nazi. He's an extremely xenophobic authoritarian leader that uses an amorphous threat to manipulate people into supporting his cause. He takes at least 10 of the 14 points of Umberto Eco's tenets of fascism. Then in Aquaman and the Lost Kingdom, he's treated as just a funny little guy. Oh, look, there's banter with his brother. Haha. He eaten a cockroach. Lol. Just forget that he did a fascist coup in an attempt to genocide 7 billion people. That happens all the time. As mentioned earlier, both of these movies go very hard into the fantasy and adventure genres. A part of that is playing into certain tropes. These tropes, when combined with the whole Ocean Master situation, just don't play well. The biggest example of these tropes is The Chosen One. This is one of, if not the most well-known trope in all of fiction. The basic idea of someone being the only hope to stop some big event or save a people because of some inherent trait is fine. I'm not a fan of it conceptually. I'm sure there's some form of it that I really enjoy, but it's usually not my thing. Most of the time, it's more or less harmless. When you combine it with leading a country, however, we run into a little thing that I like to call authoritarianism. Well, I really like to call it cringe, but that's not the point. The basic story around a chosen one is usually fairly simple. A person, usually a young man, is approached by someone or finds themselves in a situation where they're drawn to help people that are or will suffer because of a cruel tyrant. They're the only one that can put an end to the suffering. Often, their arc is to learn to accept the power they are destined to inherit. Now, let's apply that to Aquaman. The character arc I believe was intended for Arthur is to learn to distance himself from his rash and harsh behavior we saw in the submarine at the start of the movie. But in practice, I don't really see that. This trait isn't really tested all that often. He's tricked into a trial by combat by Orm when they first interact, but that's about it. They're attacked in Sicily and later by the Trench, but we don't see Arthur choose not to engage with anyone. So what do we see of Arthur's arc? Well, most of it is about accepting his responsibility to become king, and that's where we run into another problem. Orm's main motivation throughout the movie is to rule Atlantis. Being a Nazi, he does this through fear, not making his people fear him, but making them fear the surface dwellers. He uses that fear to manipulate different kings into giving him their power. When one doesn't, he attacks. So, at the core, he wants the power of a king. Arthur's arc, then, is to embrace the power of a king. Arthur's main character arc is to get closer to his Nazi brother's wants. It just feels a bit weird. And while it is true that Arthur spares Orm's life in the final battle, a clear contrast to the brutish murder of Black Manta's father, this doesn't have the same impact when you take into account that he says earlier on in the film that he's always wanted to have a brother. In other words, he didn't have an outside reason to keep Black Manta's dad alive, but he does for Orm. If we want to show Arthur becoming less aggressive and murderous without thought, we need to see more steps, and we need a moment of final catharsis that isn't lessened by the context. If Arthur growing out of his habit of recklessly charging in is part of his arc, then him charging into the climax recklessly on the biggest sea monster possible is not the right move. Congrats, you didn't kill the Nazi leader. You did, however, murder the foot soldiers that he manipulated into fighting for him. I'm sure they did deserve it, but the guy who wants to kill billions doesn't. And that's indicative of a broader issue in this film. In this movie, there are only two important characters that are not part of the Atlantean royal family. One of them is Tom Curry, who is the father of the King of Atlantis, so arguably still part of the royal family. The other is Black Manta, who is only taken seriously as a threat when he's given Atlantean armor and weaponry. Essentially, anyone who has any agency or value in this film is connected to the royal family and given value through that connection. This is all to say, the movie does a lot to justify authoritarianism. Just to clarify, I don't necessarily have a problem with that in an Aquaman story, as that is a big part of the character in the source material, but I don't feel like that was the intention here. The story in general doesn't feel like a positive representation of the Atlantean government, mostly because the king and some of the traditions of Atlantis are presented as negative from the start. Nevertheless, Arthur kills, or attempts to kill, plenty of people that aren't royal family, and when it comes to Orm, he stops himself. There is a significant amount of course correction in Aquaman and the Lost Kingdom, mostly through the existence of some kind of parliament. That being said, the main thing that Arthur does in this movie is ignore the parliament to free a Nazi from the prison and have a road trip, getting help from the criminal underworld and other royal families to achieve his goal. In the same movie, where we're given a reason to think Arthur isn't necessarily an authoritarian, he goes out of his way to ignore those reasons and act to his and other royal family members' interests and avoid any and all accountability from the people he's supposed to rule. Now, is Arthur a fascist? No, obviously not. It just comes off as very odd when the main antagonist's whole deal is that he's like the most authoritarian guy, and then have a big part of Arthur's arc in the first film be embracing the fact that his destiny is being an authoritarian leader. It feels counterproductive. There's all this talk about a true king and that he builds bridges. The anti-bigotry angle is pretty obvious, if not a bit surface level. I like it conceptually, especially when taking into account the thematic through line of Jason Momoa's mixed race heritage and reconciling these two different sides of Arthur's lineage. However, when that arc has been done once, the second time feels significantly less impactful. The xenophobia angle in both films falls somewhat flat, specifically because they put so much emphasis on the royal families. Learning to accept Atlanteans and their culture is an interesting idea, but when the people and culture they're learning to accept is that of Atlantean royalty rather than the people, we're left with a fairly surface level understanding of what the world is like. It looks amazing, but it lacks soul because we don't know anything about the people. Ultimately, the relationship the Aquaman movies have with the adventure genre is a very complicated one. It does a lot to set itself apart from other adventure movies by leaning into the fantasy of the world and combining Arthur's perspective with that of Mira and Orm. I particularly like how the movies use the setting to parallel the character arcs. I think the first Aquaman did very well with this premise. While I think it could have gone a little bit further in exploring Atlantis and the dynamics within it, it is leagues from bad. The characters stand for themselves, and the ideas are developed pretty well. It rests pretty easily in the A tier. While it's not a faithful adaptation of the character from the source material, a number of broader ideas are present and the story is good overall. As for Aquaman and the Lost Kingdom, it doesn't quite hit the same for me. It's fine, sure, but it goes over the same points as the first one while ignoring a lot of what the first film set up, especially with the characters. It takes a lot of the same steps as the first film, with Ocean Master's bigotry dissolving as he interacts with the surface world, just as Mira's did in the first one. When I compare the start of the film with the end, there's not much difference. Outside of breaking a war criminal out of prison, Arthur doesn't do much. The only thing that arguably changes is that he wants to be king again, but even this is half-baked. To that point, Arthur is not a good person in this movie. I've mentioned how chill he is with Orm a billion times now, but even outside of that, he abandons his wife when she's in critical condition only to ignore his infant son until he's kidnapped and keep the most powerful position in the world as King of Atlantis to himself even though he falls asleep during crucial meetings. This movie deserves a C tier. Comparing it to Zack Snyder's Justice League seems a bit useless since they're so fundamentally different in tone, structure, length, and goals. I'll put the Snyder Cut ahead of Aquaman and the Lost Kingdom for now though. And there we have it. Thanks for sticking around to the end. Make sure to, like, subscribe, share with your friends, relinquish your soul to me. Let me know in the comments what you think of these movies. What was your favorite part? In the next video, we'll be going over Shazam and Shazam Fury of the Gods. Until then, I'll be trying to break Water Hitler out of jail. Wish me luck, and as always, have a good one.